Marcus Rodriguez had built his empire from nothing. Starting as a ranch hand in Montana, he'd worked his way up through sheer determination and smart investments until he owned three massive cattle ranches across the state. At 45, he was worth more than most small towns' entire budgets, but money hadn't changed his core values. He still wore the same worn leather boots he'd bought 15 years ago and drove his pickup truck until the wheels fell off. The November wind cut through the valley like a blade as Marcus drove down the dirt road that bordered his smallest ranch. He'd been meaning to check on the old farmhouse that sat on the eastern edge of his property, a place he'd inherited when he bought the land but never had use for. The previous owner had mentioned something about a tenant, but Marcus had been too busy with a merger to pay attention to the details. What he found made his blood run cold. Smoke was barely trickling from the chimney of the dilapidated house, and even from a distance, he could see the roof was partially caved in. The porch sagged dangerously, and several windows were boarded up with what looked like cardboard and duct tape. This wasn't just neglect. This was poverty so severe it made his childhood look luxurious. Marcus parked his truck and approached cautiously. Through a gap in the makeshift window covering, he could see a figure moving inside. He knocked gently on the door, which looked like it might fall off its hinges at any moment. After a long pause, the door opened to reveal a woman who couldn't have been more than 35, though hardship had aged her face beyond her years. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, her voice trembling. "I know I shouldn't be here. I've been trying to find somewhere else to go, but with the kids and no money for deposits." She trailed off, looking down at her worn-out shoes. "I'm Marcus Rodriguez. I own this land." He kept his voice gentle, seeing how she flinched at his words. "What's your name?" "Elizabeth Harrison," she whispered. "My husband died 8 months ago in a car accident. Lost our house, lost everything. I heard this place was empty and I just needed somewhere for my children to sleep." Before Marcus could respond, two small faces appeared behind Elizabeth. A boy who looked about 8 and a girl who couldn't have been more than 6. Both were clean but dressed in clothes that had seen better days. Their eyes held that particular brand of wariness that came from too much uncertainty. "How long have you been here?" Marcus asked. 3 weeks," Elizabeth admitted. "I know it's trespassing. I know you could call the police. But please just give me a few more days to figure something out." Marcus looked past her into the house. What he saw broke something inside him. The family had made the best of an impossible situation, but the reality was stark. They were living in conditions that no one should have to endure, especially not children. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Elizabeth's face crumpled, and she nodded, clearly expecting the worst. But Marcus Rodriguez was about to make a decision that would change all their lives forever. He just didn't know how much it would change his own. Detective Sarah Chen had been working the case for 3 months when she finally got the break she'd been waiting for. The embezzlement at Morrison Manufacturing had been sophisticated, but every criminal made mistakes eventually. The problem was, the deeper she dug, the more she realized this wasn't just about stolen money. It was about a systematic abuse of power that had been going on for years. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. Elizabeth Harrison wanted to talk, and she claimed to have information about Marcus Rodriguez that would change everything people thought they knew about the millionaire rancher. Chen had been investigating reports of illegal labor practices on Rodriguez's properties, but so far, she'd found nothing but glowing reviews from his employees and a reputation for treating people fairly. But Elizabeth Harrison's story was different. She claimed that Rodriguez had been running an elaborate scheme, using desperate people as unpaid labor while presenting himself as a philanthropist. If it was true, it would be the biggest scandal to hit Montana in decades. Chen arranged to meet Elizabeth at a diner in town, away from Rodriguez's properties. When she arrived, she found a woman who looked like she'd been through hell. Elizabeth was nervous, constantly looking over her shoulder, and her hands shook as she stirred sugar into her coffee. "He's not who people think he is," Elizabeth began without preamble. "Everyone sees the charity donations, the scholarships he funds, the way he helps people, but it's all a front." Chen pulled out her notebook. "Tell me what you know." Elizabeth's story was compelling. She claimed that Rodriguez had approached her when she was at her lowest point, offering her and her children a place to stay in exchange for work around his properties. What started as a generous offer had gradually turned into something darker. "At first it seemed like a blessing," Elizabeth explained. "He fixed up the old house, made sure we had food, clothes for the kids. But then he started asking for more. Longer hours, harder work. When I tried to leave, he reminded me that I had nowhere else to go." According to Elizabeth, Rodriguez had been doing this for years. He would find people in desperate situations, single mothers, immigrants, people with criminal records who couldn't find work elsewhere, and offer them housing and support. Once they were dependent on him, he would gradually increase their workload while keeping them isolated from the outside world. "There are at least a dozen families like mine," Elizabeth claimed. "All of us working his properties, all of us too scared to speak up because we have nowhere else to go." Chen had seen cases like this before. Modern slavery often looked exactly like this. People trapped not by chains but by circumstances, grateful for shelter and food even when they were being exploited. The fact that Rodriguez had such a sterling reputation in the community would make it even harder for victims to come forward. "Why are you telling me this now?" Chen asked. Elizabeth's face hardened. Because yesterday he told me that my 8-year-old son was old enough to start helping with the cattle. That's where I draw the line. As Chen listened to Elizabeth's story, she began to see the pattern. Rodriguez was smart, charismatic, and careful. He chose his victims well, people who were unlikely to be believed, who had no support system, who were already marginalized by society. It was a perfect crime, hidden in plain sight. Marcus Rodriguez stood in his kitchen, staring out at the pasture where his cattle grazed peacefully in the morning sun. He'd built this life through honest work and smart decisions, but now it felt like everything was crumbling around him. The phone call from his lawyer had been brief but devastating. Detective Chen wanted to interview him about allegations of labor trafficking and exploitation. The accusations were absurd, but Marcus knew that in today's world, accusations could destroy a man's reputation before the truth ever came to light. He'd spent his entire adult life building his business and his reputation, and now a woman he'd tried to help was threatening to tear it all down. Elizabeth Harrison. He remembered the day he'd found her and her children living in that broken-down house on his property. He'd been genuinely moved by their plight, and he'd done what he thought was right. He'd fixed up the house, provided food and clothing, and offered Elizabeth work to help her get back on her feet. Everything had been voluntary, everything had been fair. Or so he'd thought. Looking back now, Marcus could see how his actions might have been misinterpreted. He'd been protective of Elizabeth and her children, perhaps overly so. He discouraged her from taking jobs in town, arguing that she needed to focus on her children's stability. He'd handled most of her interactions with social services and schools, telling himself he was helping her navigate systems she didn't understand. But had he been helping, or had he been controlling? The thought made him sick. His own childhood had been marked by poverty and powerlessness. His father had worked for ranchers who treated their workers like property, and Marcus had sworn he'd never be that kind of man. Yet here he was, accused of the very crimes he'd spent his life trying to avoid. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was his foreman, Jake Patterson, calling from the northern ranch. "Boss, we've got a problem," Jake said without preamble. "Some of the workers are talking about that detective who's been asking questions. They're scared, and some of them are talking about leaving." Marcus closed his eyes. Jake was referring to the dozen or so families who lived on his properties in housing he provided. Like Elizabeth, they were all people who'd been in desperate situations when he'd offered them work and shelter. Unlike Elizabeth, they'd all seemed grateful for the arrangement. "What are they saying?" Marcus asked. "They're worried they'll be arrested or deported if they talk to the police. Maria Santos is packing up her kids right now. Says she'd rather be homeless than get caught up in whatever's going on." Marcus felt his heart sink. Maria Santos was a single mother who'd been working for him for 2 years. She'd fled an abusive relationship with nothing but the clothes on her back and her 3 children. Marcus had given her a job, a house, and security. Now she was preparing to give it all up because she was afraid. "Tell her to wait," Marcus said. "I'm coming over." As he drove to the northern ranch, Marcus tried to make sense of what was happening. He'd always prided himself on being a fair employer, on treating people with dignity and respect. But as he thought about it more, he realized that the power dynamic had been skewed from the beginning. These weren't just employees. They were people who depended on him for everything. Their housing, their income, their children's stability, all of it was tied to his goodwill. Had he created a situation where people felt they couldn't say no to him? Had his desire to help actually trapped them in a cycle of dependency? Detective Chen sat across from Marcus Rodriguez in the interview room, studying his face as he processed the allegations against him. She'd been in law enforcement for 15 years, and she'd gotten good at reading people. Rodriguez didn't look like a man who'd been caught. He looked like a man who was genuinely confused and hurt. "I want to understand what Elizabeth Harrison has told you," Rodriguez said quietly. "Because whatever she said, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Chen opened her file. "She's alleging that you've been using your position to exploit vulnerable people, that you offer them housing and work, then gradually increase their responsibilities while keeping them isolated and dependent." Rodriguez ran his hands through his hair. "Detective, I've been helping people for years. Elizabeth and her children were living in a house with a collapsed roof and no heat. I fixed it up. I gave her work. I made sure her kids had what they needed. How is that exploitation?" "Tell me about the work arrangement," Chen said. "What were Elizabeth's responsibilities?" "At first, just basic maintenance around the property. Cleaning, some cooking, helping with paperwork. As time went on, she started helping with the cattle, feeding, basic veterinary care. She seemed to enjoy it, and she was good at it." "How many hours a day?" Rodriguez paused. "I don't know exactly. We never kept formal time records. It wasn't like a regular job." "What about wages?" "She didn't receive a traditional wage. Her housing was provided, utilities, food, clothing for the children, medical care when needed. I thought of it as a comprehensive support system rather than a traditional employment relationship." Chen made notes. This was exactly the kind of arrangement that could easily cross the line from help to exploitation, even if it wasn't intended that way. "Did Elizabeth ever express a desire to leave?" Chen asked. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. "She mentioned it once or twice, usually when she was frustrated or overwhelmed. But I discouraged it. I told her that her children needed stability, that she wouldn't be able to afford rent and childcare on what she could make in town." Was that true? I thought so at the time, but looking back, Rodriguez trailed off, his expression troubled. Looking back, I realize I might have been wrong. I might have been making decisions for her that weren't mine to make. Chen could see the moment when understanding dawned in Rodriguez's eyes. He wasn't a cartoonish villain. He was a man who'd thought he was doing good, but had created a system that trapped the very people he'd intended to help. There are other families living on your properties, Chen said. Are they in similar situations? Some of them, yes. But detective, I want to be clear. I never intended for anyone to feel trapped. I thought I was providing opportunities, not creating obligations. Intent matters, Chen said, but so does impact. The question is, what are you going to do about it now? Rodriguez looked up at her, and for the first time since the interview began, she saw something other than confusion in his eyes. She saw determination. Elizabeth Harrison sat in her small apartment in town, watching her children play with toys they'd never had when they lived on Rodriguez's ranch. The transition hadn't been easy. She was working 2 part-time jobs to make ends meet, and money was tight. But for the first time in months, she felt like she was in control of her own life. The knock on her door surprised her. It was late, and she wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened it, she found Marcus Rodriguez standing in the hallway, looking older and more tired than she'd ever seen him. "Elizabeth," he said quietly, "I was wondering if we could talk." She hesitated. Part of her wanted to slam the door in his face, but another part, the part that remembered his kindness in those early days, was curious about what he had to say. "The kids are asleep," she said finally. "We can talk on the porch." They sat in the cheap plastic chairs she'd bought at a garage sale, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Finally, Rodriguez broke the silence. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I've been thinking about what you told Detective Chen, and I realize that no matter what my intentions were, I created a situation where you felt trapped. That was wrong." Elizabeth studied his face in the dim porch light. "You helped us when we had nowhere else to go. I'm grateful for that. But you also made me feel like I owed you my life." "I never meant to do that." "I know, but that's what happened. Every time I thought about leaving, you'd remind me of everything you'd done for us. You'd talk about how the kids needed stability, how I'd never be able to provide for them on my own. After a while, I started to believe it." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "I convinced myself I was protecting you and the children, but I was really protecting my own sense of being needed, being important." "The thing is," Elizabeth said, "I think part of you genuinely cared about us, but you also liked having us depend on you. It made you feel powerful, even if you didn't admit it to yourself." The truth of her words hit Rodriguez like a physical blow. He'd spent so much time thinking of himself as a benefactor, a protector, that he'd never examined his own motivations. But Elizabeth was right. There had been something intoxicating about being needed so completely. "What can I do to make this right?" he asked. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know if you can make it right, but you can make it better. There are other families still living on your properties, still caught in the same situation I was in. They need to know they have choices." "I've been thinking about that," Rodriguez said. "I want to help them transition to independence, but I'm not sure how to do it without just abandoning them." "Start by asking them what they want," Elizabeth said. "Not what you think they need, not what you think is best for them. Ask them what they actually want." Rodriguez nodded, but Elizabeth wasn't finished. "And you need to understand something else," she continued. "Some of them are going to be angry. Some of them are going to feel betrayed. You can't fix that with money or good intentions. You're going to have to live with the fact that you hurt people, even if you didn't mean to." As Rodriguez drove home that night, Elizabeth's words echoed in his mind. He'd built his fortune by making smart decisions and taking calculated risks. But helping people wasn't a business transaction. It was a relationship. And relationships required trust, respect, and genuine equality. He had a lot of work to do. Maria Santos stood in the kitchen of the house she'd called home for 2 years, packing the few belongings she'd accumulated since arriving at Rodriguez's ranch. Her 3 children, Carlos, age 10, Isabella, age 8, and little Miguel, age 5, watched from the doorway, confusion and worry etched on their faces. "Mama, why are we leaving?" Isabella asked for the 3rd time that morning. Maria paused in her packing, struggling to find an answer that wouldn't frighten her children. How could she explain that the man who'd given them safety and security was now under investigation? How could she tell them that their safe haven might have been something else entirely? "We're going to try living in town for a while," she said finally. "It will be an adventure." But Maria knew it would be more than an adventure. It would be a struggle. She'd managed to save some money from her work on the ranch, but not enough for a security deposit and first month's rent. She'd applied for jobs in town, but without a car or reliable childcare, her options were limited. The sound of a truck pulling up outside made her heart race. Through the window, she could see Marcus Rodriguez getting out of his pickup, his face serious but not threatening. Behind him was a woman she didn't recognize, middle-aged, professional-looking, carrying a briefcase. Maria's first instinct was to hide, to pretend she wasn't home. But Rodriguez had already seen her through the window, and he was walking toward the door with a purposeful stride. "Maria," he called out, "could we talk? I have someone I'd like you to meet." Reluctantly, Maria opened the door. Rodriguez looked different than she remembered, older, more tired, but also somehow more genuine. "Maria, this is Janet Coleman," he said, gesturing to the woman beside him. "She's a social worker who specializes in helping families transition to independent living." Maria's suspicion must have shown on her face, because Rodriguez quickly raised his hands. "This isn't what you think," he said. "I'm not here to force you to stay or to force you to leave. I'm here to offer you choices." Janet Coleman stepped forward with a warm smile. "Maria, I've been working with Mr. Rodriguez to develop a program that helps families like yours achieve independence. We're not here to judge your past decisions or to make decisions for you. We're here to make sure you have the information and resources you need to make the best choices for yourself and your children." Maria looked back at her children, who were still watching from the doorway. "What kind of choices?" "Well," Janet said, pulling out a folder from her briefcase, "we've identified several apartments in town that would be suitable for your family. Mr. Rodriguez has agreed to cover the security deposits and first 3 months of rent, giving you time to establish yourself financially. We've also arranged for childcare assistance and transportation to help you get to work." Maria's eyes widened. "And what's the catch?" "No catch," Rodriguez said quietly. "This is me trying to make up for the ways I failed you and your family. You don't owe me anything, Maria. You never did." For the first time in weeks, Maria felt something like hope stirring in her chest. "What about the other families?" "We're making the same offer to everyone," Janet explained. "Some families have chosen to stay and work for Mr. Rodriguez under new, formal employment contracts with competitive wages and benefits. Others have chosen to move to town or to other parts of the state. The important thing is that everyone gets to choose." Maria looked around the house that had been her refuge for 2 years. It had been a good life in many ways, but it had also been a life where she'd never felt truly free. Now, for the first time since her husband's death, she was being offered the chance to build something that was truly her own. "I want to hear more about the apartments," she said. Detective Chen reviewed the case files one more time before making her final report. The investigation into Marcus Rodriguez had taken an unexpected turn, and she wanted to make sure she had all the facts straight. What had started as a straightforward case of labor trafficking had evolved into something much more complex. Rodriguez wasn't a criminal in the traditional sense. He was a man who genuinely tried to help people but had created a system that trapped them in dependency. His actions had been harmful, but they hadn't been malicious. The district attorney had decided not to pursue criminal charges, largely because the victims themselves had asked for leniency. Elizabeth Harrison, Maria Santos, and the other families had all testified that Rodriguez had never threatened them or used force. Instead, He'd used kindness and generosity to create a web of obligation that had been just as effective as any cage. But Rodriguez hadn't walked away from the situation unchanged. He'd worked with social services to develop a comprehensive support program for all the families who'd been living on his properties. He'd hired Janet Coleman full-time to ensure that anyone who needed help could get it without strings attached. And he'd completely restructured his business practices to ensure that all his employees were treated as equals, not dependents. Chen had seen a lot of cases in her career, but this one had taught her something important about the nature of power and exploitation. Sometimes the most dangerous abusers were the ones who convinced themselves they were helpers. Rodriguez had wielded his wealth and influence like a weapon, even as he told himself he was building a shield. The knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. It was Elizabeth Harrison, looking healthier and more confident than she had in months. "Detective Chen, I wanted to thank you for everything you've done." "How are you adjusting to life in town?" Chen asked. Elizabeth smiled. "It's not easy, but it's good. I'm working at the diner downtown and I'm taking night classes to get my bookkeeping certificate. The kids are doing well in school and we're happy." "And Rodriguez? He's kept his word. He helped us get set up and then he stepped back. He sends birthday cards to the kids, but he doesn't try to control our lives anymore. I think he's learned something from all of this." Chen nodded. "What about the other families?" "Most of them chose to stay and work for him under the new arrangements. Maria Santos moved to town like we did, and she's doing well. A few families decided to move to other states to be closer to relatives. The important thing is that everyone got to choose." After Elizabeth left, Chen sat back in her chair and reflected on the case. It wasn't the clean victory she'd expected when she'd started the investigation. Rodriguez hadn't been arrested or prosecuted, but in many ways, the outcome had been more meaningful than a traditional legal victory. Rodriguez had been forced to confront the reality of his actions and their impact on others. He'd had to give up the sense of control and importance that had driven his helping behavior, and he'd had to learn to respect the autonomy and dignity of the people he'd claimed to be helping. It was a reminder that justice wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was about transformation. Marcus Rodriguez stood in the office of his newest business venture, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping families achieve housing stability and financial independence. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was once again trying to help people, but this time he was doing it differently. Janet Coleman had been instrumental in helping him understand the difference between helping and controlling. She'd taught him about trauma-informed care, about the importance of letting people make their own decisions, about the dignity that came from earning rather than receiving. The Henderson family just got approved for their loan, Janet said, entering his office with a smile. They'll be able to buy their first house next month. Rodriguez nodded, feeling a satisfaction that was different from anything he'd experienced before. The Henderson family had been one of the families living on his ranch when the investigation began. Instead of just giving them money or housing, he'd helped them build credit, develop job skills, and save for a down payment. It had taken longer than simply providing them with a house, but it had given them something more valuable, the confidence that they could provide for themselves. "What about the Garcia family?" he asked. "They've decided to move to Texas to be closer to Mrs. Garcia's sister. We're helping them with the transition costs and job placement." Rodriguez had learned that helping people sometimes meant helping them leave. It was a lesson that had been difficult to accept, but it was crucial to his understanding of what genuine assistance looked like. His phone rang, and he was surprised to see Elizabeth Harrison's name on the caller ID. "Marcus," she said when he answered, "I have something to tell you." "What is it?" "I got the job at the accounting firm downtown, full-time with benefits. I start next month." Rodriguez felt genuine happiness for her. "That's wonderful, Elizabeth. You've worked so hard for this." "I wanted to thank you," she said. "Not for the house or the money or any of that. I wanted to thank you for learning to let me go." After she hung up, Rodriguez sat in his office thinking about the past year. He'd lost his reputation as a local hero, but he'd gained something more valuable: the knowledge that he could help people without needing to control them. The business of helping people, he'd learned, wasn't about being needed. It was about helping people discover that they didn't need you at all. Elizabeth Harrison looked around her small apartment one more time before turning off the lights. Tomorrow, she and her children would be moving into their first house, a modest three-bedroom home that she'd bought with her own savings, and a loan she'd qualified for on her own income. It had been 18 months since she'd left Rodriguez's ranch, and the transformation in her life had been remarkable. She'd gone from feeling powerless and dependent to feeling confident and capable. Her children had thrived in their new school, and she'd built a career that she was proud of. But the most important change had been internal. She'd learned to trust her own judgment, to make her own decisions, to believe in her own worth. These were lessons that no amount of charity could have taught her. Her son David came into the room carrying a box of his belongings. "Mom, are you excited about the new house?" "I'm excited about our new house," she corrected gently. "It's going to be ours because we earned it." As they loaded the last of their belongings into the moving truck, Elizabeth thought about the woman she'd been when she'd first met Marcus Rodriguez. That woman had been grateful for any help she could get, willing to accept dependency if it meant security for her children. She didn't judge that woman. She'd been doing the best she could with the resources and knowledge she'd had. But the woman she was now understood that true security came from within. It came from knowing that she could face whatever challenges life threw at her, that she had the skills and strength to provide for her family, that she didn't need anyone's permission to make her own choices. The moving truck pulled away from the apartment complex, and Elizabeth followed in her own car, a reliable used sedan she'd saved up to buy. In the rearview mirror, she could see her children chattering excitedly about their new room arrangements and the big backyard where they'd be able to play. As she drove toward their new home, Elizabeth reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. She'd started as a victim of circumstances, become entangled in a web of well-intentioned but controlling charity, and finally emerged as a woman who knew her own worth and power. It hadn't been easy, and there had been times when she'd questioned whether she was making the right choices. But every challenge she'd overcome had made her stronger, more confident in her ability to handle whatever came next. The new house was small and needed some work, but it was theirs. As she pulled into the driveway, Elizabeth felt a sense of pride and accomplishment that no amount of charity could have given her. She'd earned this through her own hard work and determination. Her daughter Sarah ran up to her as she got out of the car. "Mom, can we plant a garden in the backyard?" Elizabeth smiled, imagining the vegetables they'd grow together, the lessons about patience and nurturing that would come from tending their own little plot of earth. "Yes, sweetheart," she said. "We can plant whatever we want. It's our house, our yard, our choice." And for the first time in years, Elizabeth Harrison felt truly free. Marcus Rodriguez sat in his lawyer's office, signing the papers that would transfer ownership of his smallest ranch to a community land trust. It was the property where he'd first encountered Elizabeth Harrison, and it seemed fitting that it should become something that would help other families without creating the dependencies that had marked his earlier efforts. "This is a generous donation," his lawyer said. "The land trust will be able to help dozens of families over the years." Rodriguez nodded, but he didn't feel particularly generous. He felt like he was finally understanding what generosity actually meant. True generosity wasn't about giving people what you thought they needed. It was about giving them the tools and opportunities to get what they knew they needed. The community land trust would develop affordable housing on the property, but unlike his previous arrangements, the families who lived there would have clear paths to homeownership. They'd pay rent that would gradually build equity, and after a certain period, they'd have the option to purchase their homes at below-market rates. It was a model that promoted independence rather than dependence, and Rodriguez wished he'd understood the difference years ago. His phone buzzed with a text from Janet Coleman. The Morrison family just closed on their house. They wanted me to thank you for the down payment assistance. Rodriguez smiled. The Morrison family had been one of the last to leave his ranch, and they'd been skeptical of his motives when he'd offered to help them buy their own home. But they'd worked with Janet to develop a plan that made sense for their situation, and now they were homeowners. Over the past year, Rodriguez had helped more than a dozen families achieve homeownership or stable rental situations. But more importantly, he'd learned to help without controlling, to give without creating obligation, to support without diminishing. It had been a painful education, but a necessary one. The door to his lawyer's office opened, and Detective Chen walked in. Rodriguez was surprised to see her. Their official business had been concluded months ago. "Detective," he said, standing to shake her hand, "what brings you here?" "I wanted to talk to you about something," she said. "I've been working on a case that reminds me of yours, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to help." Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "Help how?" "There's a businessman in Billings who's been doing something similar to what you were doing. He's not technically breaking any laws, but he's creating situations where people feel trapped and dependent. I think he might benefit from hearing your story." Rodriguez considered this. A year ago, he would have been defensive, angry at the suggestion that he could help someone who'd been doing what he'd been doing. Now, he understood that his experience, both the mistakes and the learning, could be valuable to others. "I'd be willing to talk to him," he said, "but only if he's genuinely interested in changing. I can't help someone who doesn't want to be helped." Chen smiled. "I think you've learned something important about helping people." "I've learned that the most important thing about helping people is knowing when to stop," Rodriguez replied. As Chen left his office, Rodriguez reflected on how much his life had changed. He was no longer the local hero he'd once been, but he was something better. He was a man who'd learned from his mistakes and was using that knowledge to prevent others from making the same ones. It was a different kind of legacy than the one he'd originally envisioned, but it was one he could be proud of. Janet Coleman stood before a room full of social workers, non-profit directors, and community leaders, delivering a presentation about the dangers of well-intentioned but controlling charity. It was a talk she'd given dozens of times since beginning her work with Marcus Rodriguez, but it never got easier. "The road to dependency is paved with good intentions," she said, clicking to the next slide. "When we help people without including them in the decision-making process, when we solve their problems for them rather than helping them solve their own problems, we rob them of agency and dignity." The audience listened intently as Janet outlined the key principles of empowerment-based assistance: respect for autonomy, collaborative decision-making, skills building rather than simple provision, and clear boundaries between helping and controlling. I want to share a story with you, Janet continued, about a man who thought he was helping people, but was actually trapping them in cycles of dependency. She told the story of Marcus Rodriguez and the families who'd lived on his ranch, being careful to protect their privacy while illustrating the broader principles at stake. She talked about Elizabeth Harrison's journey from dependency to independence, about Maria Santos's courage in starting over, about the other families who'd had to learn that they were worth more than charity. The most important lesson from this case, Janet concluded, is that helping people is not about making them grateful to us. It's about helping them become grateful to themselves, grateful for their own strength, their own resilience, their own capacity to overcome challenges. After the presentation, a young social worker approached Janet with a question. "But how do you balance helping people with letting them struggle?" she asked. "Sometimes people make bad choices, and it's hard to watch them suffer when you could prevent it." Janet smiled, remembering asking Rodriguez a similar question months ago. "You have to trust people to learn from their own mistakes," she said. "And you have to understand that struggling through challenges is often how people discover their own strength. When we remove all struggle from people's lives, we also remove their opportunities to grow." It was a lesson that Janet had learned not just from working with Rodriguez, but from her own life experiences. She'd grown up in poverty, and she'd had well-meaning people try to help her in ways that felt more like control than support. It wasn't until she'd found mentors who believed in her capacity to help herself that she'd been able to build the career and life she had now. "The goal isn't to make people's lives easy," Janet continued. "The goal is to make their lives their own." As the young social worker walked away, Janet thought about the dozens of families she'd worked with over the past year. Not all of their stories had happy endings. Some had struggled financially. Some had made mistakes. Some had faced setbacks that could have been prevented with more direct intervention. But all of them had grown stronger, more confident, more capable of handling whatever challenges life might throw at them. And that, Janet believed, was worth more than any amount of charity. Detective Chen received the call on a rainy Thursday morning. Marcus Rodriguez was on the line, and he sounded different than she remembered, calmer, more centered. "Detective, I wanted to update you on something," he said. "Remember the businessman in Billings you asked me to talk to?" "James Morrison," Chen replied. "How did that go?" "Better than I expected. He was defensive at first, but when I told him my story, really told him, including all the ways I'd convinced myself I was helping when I was actually controlling, something clicked for him." Rodriguez went on to explain how Morrison had been running a similar operation, providing housing and work to vulnerable families while gradually increasing their dependence on him. Like Rodriguez, Morrison had convinced himself he was being generous, but the families in his care had no real autonomy or opportunity for advancement. "What's he going to do about it?" Chen asked. "He's working with Janet Coleman now. She's helping him develop a transition plan for the families, similar to what we did here. It's not going to be easy, but he seems genuinely committed to making changes." Chen felt a familiar sense of satisfaction. This was what she'd hoped would happen when she'd first suggested that Rodriguez share his story. One person's transformation could ripple outward, preventing harm to others. "There's something else," Rodriguez continued. "Morrison mentioned that he knows of at least 3 other businessmen in the region who have similar arrangements. He's willing to reach out to them, share what he's learned." This was bigger than Chen had initially realized. What she'd thought was an isolated case was actually part of a broader pattern of well-intentioned but harmful charity. People with wealth and power creating systems that trapped the very people they claimed to be helping. "I'm going to need those names," Chen said. "And I'm going to need Morrison to be willing to cooperate with any investigations that might follow." "He's already agreed to that. Detective, I want you to know that this conversation we're having, it never would have happened a year ago. I would have been too proud, too convinced of my own righteousness to admit that I'd been wrong, much less to actively work to prevent others from making the same mistakes." After Rodriguez hung up, Chen sat back in her chair and thought about the case that had changed her understanding of what exploitation could look like. It wasn't always violent or obviously criminal. Sometimes it was wrapped in kindness and generosity, making it even more insidious because it was so hard to recognize and resist. But she'd also learned something hopeful from Rodriguez's transformation. People could change, even when they'd been causing harm for years. The key was helping them see their actions from the perspective of those they'd affected, breaking through the self-serving narratives that allowed them to continue harmful behavior. Her phone rang again. This time it was Elizabeth Harrison. "Detective Chen, I hope I'm not bothering you, but I wanted to let you know about something that happened yesterday." "What is it?" "I was at the grocery store with my kids, and we ran into Maria Santos. She told me that she's been working with other families who have been in situations like ours, helping them understand their rights and options." Chen smiled. This was exactly the kind of positive outcome she'd hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. Elizabeth and Maria had taken their experiences and used them to help others, creating a network of support that was based on mutual aid rather than charity. "That's wonderful news," Chen said. "The thing is, we've identified at least 4 other families in the area who are in similar situations. They're all working for different people, but the pattern is the same: housing and work provided in exchange for complete dependency. Chen grabbed her pen and paper. "I'm going to need details." As Elizabeth provided information about the families and their employers, Chen realized that this was just the beginning. The investigation that had started with one woman's complaint about one man's controlling behavior had revealed a much larger problem. But it had also revealed something else: the power of people to transform their own lives and help others do the same. Elizabeth Harrison had gone from victim to advocate. Maria Santos had become a community organizer, and Marcus Rodriguez had learned to use his wealth and influence in ways that empowered rather than controlled. It was a reminder that justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about transformation, both individual and systemic. Elizabeth Harrison stood before a room full of social workers, legal aid attorneys, and community activists, sharing her story for the first time in public. She'd been nervous about speaking, but Janet Coleman had convinced her that her experience could help others recognize and escape similar situations. "When I first met Marcus Rodriguez, I thought he was saving my life," Elizabeth began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "And in some ways he was. My children and I were literally homeless, living in a house with no heat and a collapsed roof. When he offered us a place to stay, I was so grateful that I would have agreed to anything." She went on to describe how Rodriguez's help had gradually become control, how his generosity had created a web of obligation that had been difficult to escape. But she also talked about her own journey toward independence, the challenges she'd faced, and the satisfaction she'd found in building a life that was truly her own. "The most important thing I learned," Elizabeth said, "is that there's a difference between help that empowers and help that controls. Real help gives you the tools to solve your own problems. Controlling help solves your problems for you, but it also makes you dependent on the person doing the helping." During the question and answer session, a young woman raised her hand. "But what if someone is in a situation where they really do need that level of help? What if they can't make it on their own?" Elizabeth considered the question carefully. "I think everyone can make it on their own, given the right support and opportunities. The key is distinguishing between support that builds your capacity and support that replaces your capacity." She went on to explain the difference between giving someone a house and helping them develop the skills and resources to obtain their own housing, between providing food and helping someone develop the means to feed themselves, between solving someone's problems and helping them develop the skills to solve their own problems. "It's harder to help people in ways that empower them," Elizabeth admitted. "It takes more time, more patience, more respect for their autonomy. But it's also more effective in the long run because it creates lasting change rather than temporary relief. After the presentation, several people approached Elizabeth with questions about their own situations or situations they'd observed. A landlord wanted to know how to help tenants without creating dependency. A social worker was concerned about a client who seemed to be in a controlling charity arrangement. A community organizer wanted to know how to identify and address these situations more systematically. Elizabeth exchanged contact information with several people, and she began to see how her experience could be part of a broader movement toward more empowering forms of assistance. She wasn't just sharing her story. She was helping to build a network of people who understood the difference between help and control. As she drove home that evening, Elizabeth thought about how much her life had changed. 2 years ago, she'd been a woman who felt powerless and dependent. Now she was someone who was helping others recognize their own power and potential. It was a transformation that had required her to leave behind the safety of dependency and embrace the challenges of independence. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Her daughter Sarah was waiting for her when she got home, excited to tell her about her day at school. As Elizabeth listened to her daughter's stories, she realized that the most important gift she'd given her children wasn't a stable home or financial security. It was the model of a woman who believed in her own worth and capacity. That, she thought, was a legacy worth building. Marcus Rodriguez walked through the empty house where Elizabeth Harrison and her children had once lived. The building was scheduled for demolition next week, and he'd wanted to see it one more time before it was gone. The house had been transformed during the months when Elizabeth's family had lived there. Rodriguez had repaired the roof, fixed the plumbing, and made it warm and comfortable. But now it stood empty again, a reminder of a chapter in his life that he both regretted and was grateful for. He'd learned so much from Elizabeth and her children, though he hadn't realized it at the time. They'd taught him about resilience, about the strength that came from overcoming challenges, about the dignity that came from earning rather than receiving. But most importantly, they'd taught him about the difference between helping and controlling. Rodriguez pulled out his phone and called Janet Coleman. "Janet, I'm at the old house on the eastern property. I was wondering if we could talk about what to do with this land after the demolition." "What did you have in mind?" Janet asked. "I was thinking we could build a community garden. Something that people could rent plots in, grow their own food, build their own sense of accomplishment and community." Janet was quiet for a moment. "That's a beautiful idea, Marcus. Very different from your old approach to helping people." "That's the point," Rodriguez said. "Instead of giving people what I think they need, I want to create opportunities for them to get what they know they need." After he hung up, Rodriguez sat on the porch steps and thought about the past 2 years. He'd lost his reputation as a local hero, but he'd gained something more valuable: the knowledge that true generosity wasn't about being needed. It was about helping people discover that they didn't need him. His phone buzzed with a text from Elizabeth Harrison. Saw the news about the community garden. I think it's a wonderful idea. Sarah wants to know if she can have a plot to grow flowers. Rodriguez smiled as he typed back, "Of course. It's her garden as much as anyone's." As he drove away from the house for the last time, Rodriguez thought about the legacy he was building. It wasn't the legacy of a man who'd provided for others, but of a man who'd learned to respect others' capacity to provide for themselves. It was a harder lesson than he'd expected, but it was one that had made him a better person. And perhaps more importantly, it was a lesson that would help him continue to be genuinely helpful to others for the rest of his life. The demolition of the old house would begin next week, but the community garden would be ready for planting by spring. It seemed like the perfect metaphor for the transformation that had taken place: something old and problematic being replaced by something new and empowering. Rodriguez had learned that the best way to help people wasn't to solve their problems for them, but to help them cultivate their own solutions. Like a garden, it required patience, respect for natural processes, and faith that people had the capacity to grow and flourish when given the right conditions. As he drove toward town, Rodriguez felt a sense of peace that had been missing from his life for years. He was no longer the man who needed to be needed, but the man who could help others discover their own strength. It was a much better way to live. Detective Chen closed the case file on Marcus Rodriguez and leaned back in her chair. It had been 2 years since Elizabeth Harrison had first come to her with allegations of exploitation, and the case had evolved in ways she never could have predicted. What had started as a potential criminal investigation had become a catalyst for broader change in how the community approached charity and assistance. Rodriguez's transformation had inspired others to examine their own helping behaviors, leading to reforms in several local organizations and the development of new guidelines for empowerment-based assistance. Elizabeth Harrison had become a sought-after speaker on the topic of dependency versus empowerment, sharing her story with audiences across the state. Maria Santos had started a support group for families who'd been in similar situations, helping them navigate the transition to independence. And Rodriguez himself had become an unlikely advocate for responsible charity, working with organizations to develop programs that truly empowered rather than controlled the people they served. Chen's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was the district attorney. "Sarah, I wanted to update you on the Morrison case in Billings." He's agreed to cooperate fully with our investigation, and he's already begun implementing changes to help the families who have been working for him. That's good news, Chen said. What about the other cases Elizabeth Harrison mentioned? We're opening investigations into 3 more similar operations in the region. It looks like this was a much bigger problem than we initially realized. Chen wasn't surprised. The Rodriguez case had taught her that exploitation didn't always look like what people expected. Sometimes it was wrapped in generosity and good intentions, making it even more insidious because it was so hard to recognize and resist. The important thing, the DA continued, is that word is getting out about these kinds of situations. People are starting to recognize the warning signs, and they're speaking up when they see them. After the call ended, Chen reflected on what she'd learned from the case. Justice wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was about transformation. Rodriguez had never been prosecuted, but he'd been changed by the experience in ways that had made him a better person and prevented future harm. Elizabeth Harrison had been victimized, but she'd also been empowered by the experience, using her story to help others recognize and escape similar situations. It was a reminder that the most important work in law enforcement wasn't always about catching criminals. Sometimes it was about preventing crime by addressing the conditions that made it possible. Chen pulled out a new case file and began reading. It was another complaint about a local businessman who was allegedly exploiting vulnerable families under the guise of charity. But this time, she knew what to look for, and she had a network of advocates and resources to help address the situation. The work was far from over, but Chen felt hopeful about the progress that had been made. One woman's courage to speak up had started a chain reaction that was making the community safer and more just for everyone. That, she thought, was what real justice looked like. Elizabeth Harrison stood in her backyard, watching her children play in the garden they'd planted together. The tomatoes were ripening, the peppers were coming in strong, and the flowers Sarah had insisted on planting were blooming beautifully. It was hard to believe that just 2 years ago, she'd been a woman who felt powerless and dependent. Now she was someone who helped others recognize their own power and potential, someone who'd built a life that was truly her own. Her phone rang, and she was surprised to see Marcus Rodriguez's name on the caller ID. They spoke occasionally now, but their conversations were different than they'd been when she'd lived on his ranch. There was no underlying tension about obligation or control, just 2 people who'd shared a difficult experience and had learned from it. "Elizabeth," Rodriguez said when she answered, "I wanted to let you know that the community garden is ready. We're having an opening ceremony next weekend, and I was wondering if you and the kids would like to come." Elizabeth looked around her own backyard, at the garden she'd planted with her own hands on her own land. "I think we'd like that," she said. "Sarah's been asking about it." "There's something else," Rodriguez continued. "I've been asked to speak at a conference about responsible charity next month. I was wondering if you'd be willing to speak with me, share your perspective on what we went through." Elizabeth considered this. She'd been speaking publicly about her experience for more than a year now, but she'd never shared a platform with Rodriguez. It would be a powerful statement about the possibility of transformation and reconciliation. "I'd be honored to," she said. After she hung up, Elizabeth thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. She'd been a victim, but she'd also been a survivor. She'd been helped, but she'd also been harmed. She'd been controlled, but she'd also been empowered. Most importantly, she'd learned that her worth wasn't determined by what others gave her, but by what she was able to give herself and others. Her son David came running up to her, excited about something he'd discovered in their garden. "Mom, look, the sunflowers are taller than me now." Elizabeth smiled, looking at the flowers they'd planted together. Like her children, like herself, they'd grown strong and tall because they'd been given the right conditions and the freedom to flourish. "They're beautiful, sweetheart," she said, "just like you." As the sun set over their small but perfect backyard, Elizabeth felt a sense of gratitude that had nothing to do with charity or dependence. She was grateful for her own strength, her own resilience, her own capacity to build a life worth living. It was the best kind of gratitude, the kind that came from within. The community garden's opening ceremony was held on a perfect Saturday morning in late spring. Marcus Rodriguez stood before a crowd of families, community leaders, and local officials, but his eyes kept finding Elizabeth Harrison and her children in the audience. "2 years ago, I thought I understood what it meant to help people," Rodriguez began. "I thought generosity was about giving people what they needed, about solving their problems for them, about making their lives easier." He went on to tell the story of his transformation, being careful to respect the privacy of the families who'd been affected by his actions, while still conveying the important lessons he'd learned. "I learned that there's a difference between helping and controlling, between generosity and manipulation, between charity and empowerment. Real help doesn't make people dependent. It helps them become independent." When he finished speaking, Elizabeth took the microphone. She talked about her own journey, about the challenges of leaving dependency behind, about the satisfaction of building a life that was truly her own. "The most important thing I learned," she said, "is that everyone has the capacity to overcome challenges and build a good life. Sometimes we need support and opportunities, but we don't need someone else to make our decisions for us." After the speeches, Families began exploring the garden plots that would be available for rent. Children ran between the raised beds, parents discussed what vegetables they might grow, and community members began making connections with one another. Rodriguez watched Elizabeth and her children explore the garden, and he felt a sense of peace that had been missing from his life for years. They were here by choice, not obligation. They were participating in something he'd helped create, but they weren't dependent on him for their happiness or security. Sarah Harrison ran up to him, her face bright with excitement. "Mr. Rodriguez, can I really have a plot to grow flowers?" "Of course," Rodriguez said, kneeling down to her level. "What kind of flowers do you want to grow?" "All kinds. Sunflowers and roses and daisies and everything." Rodriguez smiled, remembering the girl who'd been so quiet and wary when he'd first met her. Now she was confident and enthusiastic, secure in her place in the world. "That sounds like a beautiful garden," he said. As the ceremony wound down, Rodriguez found himself standing next to Elizabeth as they watched their children play together in the garden. "Thank you," Elizabeth said quietly. "For what?" "For learning to let us go. For learning that helping people sometimes means stepping back and letting them help themselves." Rodriguez nodded, understanding that this was the real gift they'd given each other, the opportunity to learn and grow from their shared experience. As families began to leave, making plans for their gardens and their futures, Rodriguez felt a sense of satisfaction that was different from anything he'd experienced before. He'd helped create something beautiful, but he'd done it in a way that empowered rather than controlled. It was a much better way to help people, and a much better way to live. The story of Marcus Rodriguez and Elizabeth Harrison had become something of a local legend, but it was the kind of legend that inspired change rather than just admiration. Their transformation had rippled outward, affecting how the entire community thought about charity, assistance, and the relationship between those who help and those who are helped. Janet Coleman had documented their story in a book that was being used by social workers and nonprofit organizations across the country. Detective Chen had developed training programs to help law enforcement recognize the signs of well-intentioned but controlling charity. And Elizabeth Harrison had become a national speaker on the topic of empowerment-based assistance. But perhaps the most important legacy of their story was the simple understanding that helping people wasn't about making them grateful to you. It was about helping them become grateful to themselves. Rodriguez continued to run his ranches and his nonprofit organization, but he did so with a deep understanding of the difference between charity and empowerment. He'd learned that the best way to help people wasn't to solve their problems for them, but to help them develop the skills and resources to solve their own problems. Elizabeth had built a successful career as a financial counselor, helping other families achieve the kind of stability and independence she'd worked so hard to attain. Her children had grown up seeing their mother as someone who believed in her own worth and capacity, and they'd internalized those values in ways that would serve them throughout their lives. The community garden had become a symbol of this new approach to helping people. It didn't give people food. It gave them the opportunity to grow their own food. It didn't solve their problems. It gave them a place to develop their own solutions. And every spring, when the garden came to life with new plantings and new possibilities, it served as a reminder that the most beautiful growth happens when people are given the right conditions and the freedom to flourish on their own terms. The story of Marcus Rodriguez and Elizabeth Harrison was, ultimately, a story about the power of transformation. It was about the possibility of change, the importance of recognizing when help becomes control, and the dignity that comes from earning rather than receiving. But most importantly, it was a story about the human capacity to learn, grow, and become better versions of ourselves, even when that process is difficult and painful. As Elizabeth often said in her speeches, the best help is the help that helps you help yourself. It was a lesson that had changed her life, and it was a lesson that continued to change the lives of others who heard her story. In the end, that was the most important discovery of all, that true generosity wasn't about being needed, but about helping people discover that they didn't need you at all. It was about creating conditions for growth rather than creating dependency, about empowering rather than controlling, about believing in people's capacity to build their own lives rather than building their lives for them. It was a lesson that had transformed a controlling millionaire into a true helper, a dependent woman into an empowered advocate, and a community into a place where people could thrive on their own terms. And that transformation continued to ripple outward, changing lives and communities in ways that would be felt for generations to come. The story of Marcus Rodriguez and Elizabeth Harrison had become more than just a personal journey. It had become a blueprint for a better way of helping people, a model for what genuine generosity could look like. In the end, the most important discovery was that everyone had the capacity to grow, to change, to become better versions of themselves when given the right conditions and the freedom to flourish. It was a discovery that had changed everything, and it was a discovery that would continue to change everything for years to come.